To welcome everyone to today's, this month's webinar. My name is Greg Johnson. I'm the head of the ERISA Technical Services Committee here at Multnomah Group. This is the first webinar of the year for the Technical Services Committee. For this month, we're sort of going back to some of the basics of fiduciary oversight. If you think of some of what we did last year, there was obviously a lot going on last year with the pandemic. I think initially we were talking about the Secure Act, and then the CARES Act came along. There was a lot of litigation update. Right now, we're in a little bit of a slow period. The administration is turning over. There's some talk about some legislation. I think there's Secure Act 2.0 out there that'll likely move forward at some point. So we'll be providing updates on that. But today, we really wanted to just take a step back and, like I said, go back to some of the basics. So what we're focusing on today is the fiduciary file. And we'll talk about, why you need a fiduciary file, walk through one way in which a fiduciary file could be organized, and then talk about some of the items that you would see in a typical fiduciary file. And then at the end, we'll just have some open conversation about some best practices. So as I mentioned, my name is Greg Johnson. I'm joined today by Haley McLaughlin, a consultant and director of our Vendor Services Committee, and Brian Montanez, a principal with the firm. So we'll start with, why should you have a fiduciary file? And I think anyone who has an investment committee typically does have one location where you keep all your documents, but Section 107 of ERISA does require the plan records be kept for at least 6 years. Now, even with that rule, the IRS has said that you really should keep retirement records until the trust or IRA has paid all benefits and enough time has passed that the plan won't be audited. So it's really a best practice to retain virtually anything related to your plan, probably for the life of the plan and even for a year after a plan is terminated. I think the most important thing about a fiduciary file in my mind is this fourth bullet point that says it just helps a committee or a plan sponsor ensure that you have a process in place for collecting and retaining documents all in one location. And by collecting everything in one space, when questions arise, which inevitably they do, about some of the historical activity within a retirement plan, committee members or plan sponsors know where, they have sort of the one source of truth for everything that happened. And some of the reasons that it's so critical, some of the things that you'll go into your fiduciary file and be pulling documents out is things like audits. If there's a legal challenge to the plan, I mentioned earlier that there was a fair amount of litigation last year. If you do find yourself in a situation, both sides, both plaintiffs and defendants, are going to want to see everything that's been documented relative to the plan. Participant questions, if there's questions about the historical nature of the plan. Also, one thing that I find helpful when you think about all the minutes and everything that's in there, as committee members turn over, your fiduciary file is actually a great place for committee members to sort of get up to speed on what's happening within the plan, what the past is, sort of what the decision-making process is. I really consider retirement plans to be pretty evolutionary. They just sort of take steps in sort of becoming what they are. There isn't just one quick fix for everything. And that fiduciary file provides sort of a track record of what's happened. I'll maybe open it up to Haley and Brian and see if there's any other sort of thoughts on why it's so important to have this fiduciary file.
Yeah, Greg. Actually, I'll give you a couple practical reasons and things I've come across in my practice. The Social Security maybe letter. So that's the letter that the Social Security will send to participants when they apply for Social Security. And it'll say something like, your former employer may owe you this benefit. The Social Security doesn't get notice that you took your money out. And the longest duration that I've actually seen in my practice was 19 years, meaning a participant came to the committee and said, I have this letter from the Social Security Administration that says you owe me something like $27,000. And the participant did in fact take a distribution, a full distribution, and we were in fact able to find those forms. But the crazy part is it was from 3 vendors prior. So it wasn't the current vendor. It wasn't the vendor. Sorry, it was a vendor replaced 3 times. So it wasn't the current vendor. It wasn't the former vendor. It wasn't even the former vendor. It was a vendor from 4 times ago. So without that letter, the IRS says we always have to be able to prove a benefit. So without that distribution form, that participant could have made a really ugly situation for my client. And then plan documents, and it depends on the way your vendor handles plan documents. Some will create an amendment number 1, number 2, number 3, and that's easy to track changes. Some vendors just restate the document every time you make a change, and there's no reference to the prior benefit. So it's very easy a year or 2 or 5 years later to have forgotten what those benefit changes were. And your auditor might ask, attorney might ask, or a participant just may say, hey, how come I have a different vesting schedule than Jane who sits next to me? Well, we made that change 5 years ago. So keeping those documents can be very beneficial. And then, in this litigious world, fund changes, right? Why did the committee make this decision to change this fund out? And I probably help clients respond to 10 or 15, participant questions like that each year. Why did you do this? I love that fund, or this, that, the other thing. So to have those minutes that can, 1, protect you from legal, right? So we had a prudent process that we followed, and here is the documentation. And 2, just to give you the logic so that you can participate, you can communicate with that participant as to why those changes.
I totally agree. I mean, I think, we've laid out the legal requirements here, but I think the practical ones are in some ways more important. That historical context for why things are running the way they are. So, we've had committee members say, hey, why are we doing this thing? It's kind of a pain. Like, why do we have to process this way? And it's because 6 audits ago, the auditor pointed out this issue, and this is how we resolved it. And committees turn over. I mean, some have term limits, so the turnover is, expected. But that historical context is really vital. And as Brian mentioned, there's other kinds of turnover that will impact your plan. And so a turnover in a record keeper may lose some historical context there. So that's why you should maintain your own fiduciary file, or turnover in an investment consulting firm. I mean, if you aren't retaining all of the documents we provide and then go somewhere else, I don't know how you would have those for yourself.
All right, thank you. So what we wanted to walk through today, the way you choose to organize your fiduciary file is really sort of dependent upon the way that you want to categorize the information. So, these 5 sort of categories are one way that we've laid out to sort of suggest organizing your file, but it's certainly not the only way to do it. I think what's important is not necessarily what the different files within there, what the sub-files are, but just to ensure that you have all the information in there. But we're going to go through each one of these and sort of talk about the types of documents, the types of things that you would see in each of these categories. So when you start with the legal plan documents, you're going to have some pretty standard things, like obviously you need to have your retirement plan document and any additional documents that, whether it's amendments or adoption agreements, summary plan descriptions. But I think one question for Brian, as you look at this list, will all plans have all of these things on here? Should all plans have these things?
Well, no and yes. What do I mean? So it depends on what type of plan you are and what type of entity you are. So first off, with the retirement plan documents, the IRS is very clear. Any benefit plan has to be in writing. That's simple. So everybody's going to have a plan document, except potentially a nonprofit organization that has those non-qualified executive benefits, the 457F plan, for the 1 or 2 very senior people. That doesn't necessarily have to be a plan document. Those benefit rights and features can be written into the service contract. So with the exception of the F plan, you're going to need a separate plan document, but the F plan can actually have the benefits, rights, and features written into the contract. And And then it depends, if you're subject to ERISA or not. So even for nonprofit employers can be subject to ERISA or non-ERISA. So when you look at summary plan description, summary annual report, summary material modifications, those are ERISA documents. While the record keeper may provide them, you're not required to send them if you're not subject to ERISA. So if you're looking for your SPD or your SMM or your SAR, you may not have it because you are not subject to ERISA. And then for determination letters, yes, period. Yes. If you don't have one, that is not against the law, but you have no assurance that your document is written in compliance with the IRS code. That's what the determination letter is. Whether it's a prototype, a volume submitter, a custom document, whoever, you really should have the IRS determination letter saying that the document does reflect the IRC. Trust agreements, custodial agreements, and insurance contracts. Those are really vendor specific. So what I mean by that is, a 401k and 401a and 457, so governmental entities, for-profit entities, they're required to have a trust to hold the assets. But a custodial agreement and an insurance contract, and I think the answer is in that name, insurance, right? So a lot of 403Bs have been and continue to be offered via insurance contracts. Custodial agreements, while are very popular since 2009 in the 403B world, occasionally they do exist in the ERISA 401k for-profit plan. But when we see custodial agreements, it can be a group custodial agreement, which is very similar to a trust, right? It's a group custodial account where the institution has authority, but there can also be individual custodial agreements, which are not enforceable at the plan sponsor level. So they're between the participant and the record keeper. So it depends on if you're subject to ERISA, if you're a 403B, a 401k, a 457, potentially even a church plan. There's differences in church plans and their application of the IRC. So it really does depend, Greg, but this does a pretty good job of outlining the basic documents. And if you have any questions, give your vendor a call and say, some guy with a gray beard told me I need to have a custodial agreement or an insurance contract, and they can explain it to you.
All right, thank you. So that's the legal plan documents file. Moving on, a lot of plan sponsors have third parties that are helping them out with the overall management of the plan, and you can see some of these individuals here. Typically there's a charter that authorizes the committee to go ahead and hire those individuals, but anyone that you're working with outside of the employee of the plan sponsor, you want to maintain all documents related to those service providers. You want to have their contracts, you want to have the RFPs to show how they were selected, and any communications between you and that third party, any materials that they provide you in sort of the regular administration of the plan. And then also some documentation showing what's the ongoing monitoring of that third party. And I might have Haley make a few comments related to sort of that ongoing monitoring component.
Right. I mean, you've got it exactly right. As soon as you start delegating any responsibility for the administration of the plan to another party, you have to continue to monitor their services and their fees, especially if you're paying them out of the plan. So clearly any contracts that you have with any of these service providers are vital. If you've done an RFP or a request for bid, or they've provided any sort of proposal, retain all of those. But this documentation showing the ongoing monitoring with third party is really broad, and it can be a lot of different things. So a lot of our record keeping partners provide plan health reviews of the plans. We recommend keeping those. If you're getting 408B2 notices, so these fee notices that they're providing, retain those. Really, any conversations that you have around monitoring the services and the fees during a committee member should be retained. I mean, we're already retaining meeting minutes, but making sure that that monitoring conversation is included in the meeting minutes is really, really vital. And I mean, a lot of your monitoring is going to be of the record keeper because they are out of all of these doing sort of the most activity related to the plan, but you do have the duty to monitor all service providers, and that includes investment consultants such as Multnomah Group, I like to think that we make it fairly easy because of our sort of independent structure. We are not selling you managed accounts and then helping you monitor our managed accounts. That's not something we're involved in. So I would be remiss if I didn't say that we can help you monitor your record keeper, but you do have a duty to monitor your other service providers, including your investment consultant.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
you're right. You typically see the, when you think about monitoring and RFPs and RFIs, a lot of times it's, more often than not, it's sort of tied to your record keeper, your third party administrator. I think investment consultants certainly need to be monitored relative to fees and the services that they're provided. You probably don't see as much oversight of your auditor and your attorney. But I think, the investment consultant and record keeper is the most common. What are your thoughts on RFPs?
I mean, ERISA doesn't require any specific timeline to do RFPs, but we've seen from recent litigation that there's a clear understanding that benchmarking and fee negotiation, no matter how well it's going, is not a replacement for a competitive search in the marketplace. So if you haven't done one in 10 years or more, it's probably time to look at that and make sure that you're documenting that monitoring, because the monitoring is more than just fees. We want to look at services, and the industry moves so quickly and innovations continue to happen. You want to make sure that your services, both to the plan sponsor but also the participants, are keeping pace.
Yeah, let me add on to that. Haley, you said 10, as in 10 years.
Yeah.
The courts and ERISA don't define, as Haley mentioned, how often you should do an RFP. But in recent court cases, the court has opined that 10 years is too long to wait. So we know the answer is something less than 10 based on what the courts are saying in these cases. But I also want to back up to monitoring. So ERISA is very clear. If you pay for a service out of plan assets, you have to monitor that service and make sure the fees are reasonable for the services received. That's absolutely clear. What's less clear is if you're not subject to ERISA. So if you're a governmental entity, a church plan, a non-ERISA 403B plan, well, then you're going to fall back to your state trust laws. And here in California, the state trust laws are written very similar to ERISA. So even if you are a non-ERISA church plan or a non-ERISA 403B plan, you still do have an obligation to make sure that the fees you're using from the plan to pay for services are reasonable for the services that you're receiving. So there's an implicit trust law that says, yeah, you need to monitor the service providers to make sure that they're doing a good job of what you're hiring them and that you're paying only reasonable fees. So just because you're not subject to ERISA doesn't mean that you get a free pass on this.
Yeah, and to your point on the litigation, we've seen several settlements where an RFP, well, first off, hiring an investment consultant is required as part of the settlement for the non-monetary portion. And then a requirement that they do put the entire plan out to bid is we're seeing it in almost every settlement as one of the pieces.
Yeah.
Yep. And that also doesn't mean that you have to change record keepers. It does mean that you should go out to bid and that takes some work, but it's not the same amount of work as a full transition. You're not required to change record keepers, but you should make sure that you are getting, competitive bids.
Actually, a funny story, and I believe my client is on this conference call. We are issuing an RFP for one of my clients because of some service failures. And once the record keeper got the RFP, they've become very attentive to my client. And the head of HR actually sent me a note a couple of days ago saying, wow, looks like they got the message. Like, yeah. So, just issuing the RFP really let the vendor know that this isn't just a cranky client. This is a legitimate issue that an entire full committee has discussed and decided, no, we need to evaluate the market and potentially leave. So the client and I both had a good laugh at that now they're getting responses timely.
All right. So as far as the committee or the plan sponsor governance, there's a whole host of documents. This is sort of getting into more of the day-to-day operation of the plan, and this is where this will probably be one of the largest files if you were to organize it in these 5 categories that I described. First is the governing documents. First off, your board is a fiduciary, and not all board members necessarily. Well, it's typically a fiduciary, almost always. Not all board members really realize that, because what we see happening is the board then delegates that fiduciary responsibility to a committee or some individual employee at the employers. The board isn't, the board still has responsibility to monitor that committee or receive reports from that committee that they're meeting their fiduciary duty. So ultimately, that board is still has some fiduciary responsibility relative to that plan. But if they do shift that to a committee, then oftentimes what we see is a committee charter. The charter sort of creates the committee, talks about how often you'll meet, what some of the oversight will be, and then that committee will then develop an investment policy statement. And the investment policy statement is what really gets into more of the detail of how are you going to select, monitor, and then eventually potentially replace investments within the retirement plan. Now, technically, you don't need any of these governing documents. You don't have to have them. But most is certainly a best practice would suggest that you do have most of them. If you do have these documents, I just can't stress enough, it is critical that you, as a committee, even though it may seem repetitive, take a look at the charter and the investment policy statement once a year. Make sure all committee members understand sort of what the rules of engagement are for your committee as it relates to that plan. So, if you do have a charter, if you do have an IPS, it's just critical that you do ensure that you continue to follow that regularly. The next set of documents are just some ongoing oversight documents that you're going to want to maintain. Quarterly investment reports, all meeting minutes, any fund recommendations. Brian was alluding to it earlier. Including the minutes as it relates to fund recommendations. The minutes should sort of clearly state some of the reasons for the decision. Now, your meeting minutes don't have to be a verbatim of what happened in the meeting. They can be fairly general. But if there was discussion about a fund replacement, for example, and ultimately it was decided to either retain or replace the fund, that should be captured in some form so that if there's questions later on about that, you can go back to the record and look at it. Fee benchmarking, we were talking about that. If you're not going to do an RFP or haven't done it for a while, annual fee benchmarking to at least have some sense of whether or not the fees that are coming out of the plan or that you're paying for third-party providers are reasonable. Share class monitoring. This is a big one that you see coming up in a lot of the litigation. A lot of the allegations are that there were lower cost investments that were essentially the exact same fund, but just at a lower cost to the participants. And then any record keeper reports. Now, this is sort of a shameless plug, but Multnomah Group does support plan sponsors with all of these oversight documents, probably with the exception of some of the record keeper reports that obviously come directly from whoever's doing the day-to-day record keeping. You also want to keep track of any fiduciary training documentation that's provided to the committee. And maybe I'll open this one up now to Haley and Brian to give any thoughts on sort of what you've seen from fiduciary training and why it's important.
Sure. So maybe I'll set the stage, but the Department of Labor requires plan sponsors to educate their fiduciaries on their responsibilities. And that makes sense. I mean, with retirement plans, we're talking about arguably for most individuals, other than their home, this is their largest asset that they have for retirement. So it's a really big responsibility. And we want to make sure that everyone that is a fiduciary and is making these fiduciary decisions knows what that means and knows what their responsibilities are. And so to again, maybe plug Multnomah Group, we have created a fiduciary training program that that helps with that training, and we bring it to committee meetings to go through it, and also to show that we are training fiduciaries. And I will mention that on the resources page of our website, you can find links to all of our fiduciary training documents, and that includes information about, for example, a committee charter and the best practices there, or best practices for meeting minutes, or how our fee benchmarking process works. We've got a whole host of information there that's available for anyone.
From the fiduciary training, I would say there's one thing that regularly pops out with committees, and it's do we have to do education? And I like to have a little fun in my committee meetings, so I usually ask for a show of hands, and almost everybody thinks that education is a requirement under ERISA. And in fact, it's not a requirement. The requirement is to deliver the appropriate disclosures and notices that will allow a participant to make an informed decision, but you're not legally required to provide participant level education. So that's one when we go through the training program, it always gets people.
All right, thank you. So now we move into the regulatory compliance filings. Brian, similar to the other question about some of the legal documents, is everyone going to have all of these documents, or are there some that maybe you wouldn't necessarily have?
Again, that goes back, Greg, to what type of plan we're talking about: ERISA, non-ERISA, government, private industry, church, like a non-qualified church control organization or a qualified church control organization. So it really does depend. So 5500s and 8955 SSAs, that's ERISA. So church plans, non-403Bs, governmental entities, they're not going to have that. But for the ones that do, please don't get rid of it. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, the Department of Labor actually sent out a letter, not a couple weeks ago, a couple months ago, and then they followed up a couple weeks ago. They sent out letters to many plan sponsors saying, hey, we haven't received your 5500 and you're now late, because they didn't send out, and the DOL had a mistake and didn't recognize the extension filings that plan sponsors did actually file. So in a case like that, the DOL could come and say, hey, you're late with your 5500, or you didn't file your 5500, and we're going to assess these massive penalties. So you really do need to keep that 5500 and or the proof of the extension, because it may not be your fault. In this case, it was the DOL. They made a mistake, and they sent out a public notice recently acknowledging that mistake. As far as ERISA fidelity bond, well, that's in the answer, right? ERISA. But a fidelity bond is probably a good idea. They're not expensive, and the fidelity bond protects the participants in case of basically theft from someone in the organization. Very inexpensive, very valuable piece. And then fiduciary insurance. Like I said before, fiduciary can be ERISA or it can be your state trust laws. In my opinion, everybody should have some measure of fiduciary insurance coverage. Fee disclosures go back to ERISA. That's an ERISA requirement, but most record keepers will make it available to plan sponsors. And yes, it is a good informational piece, if not legally required piece, to distribute to participants. Documentation of any plan corrections, absolutely. Doesn't matter what type of plan you are. You might just have to explain it a little bit later. And quick aside, we'll get to questions at the end of the presentation, but there actually is a question posted that's similar to this, which is, what do we do when we couldn't find the contributions? Audited financial statements, again, you may have to prove that you actually did have the audit, and more importantly, that you had a clean audit and there were no corrections required. Non-discrimination tests, that's an interesting one. So qualified church control, or I should say non-qualified church control organizations, ERISA plans, they all have to do non-discrimination tests because it's, because it's IRS, not because it's ERISA. Non-discrimination testing doesn't actually get filed or reported to anyone. So no one is ever going to have another copy of your non-discrimination test. But if the IRS ever comes knocking, and about 2% of plans will get audited, they're going to ask you for your non-discrimination test. And it's not like you're going to be able to go say, well, we sent it to so-and-so, let's go get it. No, you have to keep it. You have to store it, and then you'll have to provide it. And corresponding with regulatory agencies, asked and answered in the question, right?
Yeah, to that question about the documentation, it's a pretty specific question. And I would think that, obviously you would want to go to whoever was record keeping the plan at the time as well to see if they have that information, if the plan sponsor doesn't have it. I know the question specifically asked about contributions, but hopefully the record keeper, the holder of the account, would have some record of the historical money that was put in on behalf of that participant.
Yeah, if we're addressing that one question, absolutely. The record keeper should have a detailed, I mean, that's what they do, right? Keep records of participants' money. So they should have a detailed assessment of how much was contributed to the plan on behalf of that participant by payroll, or not by payroll because they're not the payroll processor, but by contribution date. So you may have a little bit of, is this January 3rd contribution belong in the prior year or this year? But yeah, they'll have detailed records of that. And you can also go back to the non-discrimination testing because you kept all your non-discrimination testing records. You'll have detailed information on contributions and salary. As it relates to non-discrimination testing, keep in mind, you don't have to give it to anybody. So you're going to have to hold it. And for 401k plans, starting in 2021, and this is going to get a little complicated, folks, hang on. There's a new rule that says permanent part-time employees may no longer be excluded. What does that mean? So in the 2024 plan year, any employee that was credited with more than 500 hours in the prior 3 years, so 21, 22, 23, has to be allowed into the plan for salary deferral purposes. You can exclude them for employer contributions, no problem. It won't affect your testing, but they have to be allowed in for salary deferral. So if you change payroll providers, you could lose all those records. But if you are doing non-discrimination testing, one of the things you have to give whoever does the testing for you is hours. So if you properly store those non-discrimination tests come 2024, you can just look back and say, Jane was credited with X hours for these 3 years, and then you can make your determination of whether or not that person does have to be offered salary deferral. Sorry, took a left-hand turn there.
As we move into the last file is the participant-related documents, and this includes employee education, advice materials, anything that's sent out to participants. Obviously, you want to capture any complaints and the resolution of any significant complaints. Eligibility, how you're tracking eligibility, your hardship and loan information, plan demographic and census data, and your enrollment materials, samples of what people use to get into and out of the plan. There is a question here about, what record keeper reports do you recommend running and keeping on file? I think as a committee, you have some responsibility to sort of understand the demographic data as sort of what's happening in your plan, what the levels of participation are. A couple of the things that I think are helpful there from your record keeper at a minimum would probably be, an annual plan review or some type of report about what's happening within your plan as it relates to the individual participants. Haley, Brian, I don't know if you have additional thoughts regarding some of the participant-related things that you should be keeping.
So I would go back and say, kind of related to the other question, contributions, right? Who received what contribution? Was it employer or employee? And that'll break it all out. The record keeper can break that all out for you. But in addition to that, the education efforts, the type of materials provided, the advice offered by the participants, some form of a review of that advice to make sure that advice is unbiased. And I'm going to say that one again, unbiased. We don't want record keepers providing advice to their proprietary investments. And you'd be surprised. You'll see record keepers say, hey, we want to call attention to our new stable value or guaranteed contract, and we're going to put a slide in there. No, you're biasing participants. So keep track of the education materials that were delivered, the advice that was delivered to participants, because you may have to go back and prove that you were unbiased, and you may have to go back and prove that you gave good unbiased education efforts.
I think it's worth mentioning too that participant complaints are not just, Joe coming to you and saying he really wants a gold fund in the plan. I mean, Brian, I know you've walked through this delineation of what is an official participant complaint. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, Joe walking down the hallway and saying, "Hey, how come we don't have Bitcoin in our plan?" That's not a complaint. A complaint would be, a participant filing a claim against you, saying, I'm paying too many fees because of you. I'm invested in funds that aren't performing well because of you, and legal counsel is sending this letter to you or filing a complaint against you. Not Joe and Jane walking down the street, because they had a bad day, yelling, "Hey, my 401k balance is down," or "I want Bitcoin." No. This is a legal question.
Thanks.
And then the hardship stuff, and this depends. Doesn't depend. The ease of documentation depends on who's doing it. But remember, hardships, you have to prove the hardship. And if your HR office is approving the hardships, depending on if that person really truly understands what hardships are, they may not be collecting the proof of need. And that happens actually a lot more than I would have ever expected. And I have the same conversation at least 3-4 times a year, which is, "Oh, wait, we have to get proof of the need." Yes, you do. And you have to store it. But if your record keeper is doing it, I feel better that they're getting proof of it. But periodically, you should go to the record keeper and say, "What are we doing for proof of hardships? What are we doing for proof of RMDs, for the notice of the RMDs? What are we doing for that type of proof?" And then obtain those records and keep those records, especially if you're going to leave that record keeper. Because if that record keeper is approving those hardships and now you're going to leave them, you're leaving all that proof open, you're leaving all that proof behind, and you're leaving yourself open to litigation.
Yeah, and then one thing that came up at the beginning that I just wanted to sort of touch on, the question about who's responsible for keeping all of this. And, we're talking about documentation that spans tens of 20, the life of the plan.
Right.
And, some people have asked, well, can I outsource that? And that's certainly, you can get assistance in collecting these documents. Sort of like Brian's saying, there's certain things that are going to be maintained at the record keeper, certain things that others might hold. But ultimately, you as the plan sponsor are responsible for the maintenance of that file. And one of the things that I thought about is if you somehow have outsourced it, the people running the plan still have to know what they're supposed to send to that third party to keep in the file. So, even if you say, well, someone else is keeping all that for us or maintaining it for us, you still have a responsibility to understand what should and shouldn't be in there. Haley and Brad, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that particular topic, and then we'll sort of get into some questions.
No, I totally agree with you, though.
I do agree. Yeah. I mean, it would, of course, it would be nice if you could outsource this. It's a fair amount of work. I mean, we've spent the last 40 minutes talking about all of these documents we think you should have, but ultimately it is the plan sponsor's responsibility. And while you can get help, I think that given the potential for turnover and the liability that it opens you up to, I think it's a responsibility that you really need to take on yourself. And I wish there was an easy button, but there's just not.
Yeah. All right, why don't we get into a couple of the questions? I think we've addressed the one regarding the proof of the contributions and touched on some of the record keeper reports. I think especially for the record keeper, though, whatever your record keeper provides to provide oversight and information regarding the plan is the type of information I'm thinking of there. We have a question, do we have to keep the annual investment reports for each of the plan's funds? Any thoughts on that one?
Yes. Because you could very clearly have to prove both fees and performance if you're ever sued. So absolutely.
All right. And then I think one more here related to, and I'll be interested to see if either of you have some thoughts on this. The one related to the uniform prudent management of Institutional Funds Act. The question is whether that considerations there play a role in investment policy guidance. I would say, so what we're talking about with investment policy statements here is defined contribution plans, not sort of your typical endowment. And so there's probably some things in there that could be leveraged for an investment policy statement, but investment policy statement for a retirement plan is very different than sort of the oversight that you have for an endowment or foundation or for a pot of money that the employer can pretty easily make decisions for. The unique thing about a retirement plan is it has direct impact on your employees that they see. And so that's actually a really good question for me to sort of further explain my comment at the beginning about retirement plans being sort of the evolution of a retirement plan. Your committee might come together and decide, we want to do all these things to our retirement plan. But because of the impact on your participants, you might decide, why don't we skinny down the fund lineup first? Then why don't we look at a different fee model? Then why don't we look at the oversight? You might decide to do it piecemeal. So the investment policy statement does cover how you select and monitor investments, but it typically, for a defined contribution plan, also includes information about how you're going to communicate things. It might include within that IPS, sometimes it's separate, a loan policy statement, but it might include some information about how you're going to handle loans. It can include information about employee education. It can include information about distributions. Those aren't things that you really have to worry about if your oversight is of an endowment or a foundation. So Haley, Brian, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Paul, I would just say, look at the IPS that we drafted for you. There should be some fee policy language in there, but yeah, generally I would say that the UPM IFA does not broadly or specifically apply to defined contribution plans, but the concept of how you're going to apply fees does, and that should be in your investment policy statement. But if it were a pension plan, then we might use some of those practices. Yeah.
All right.
So Greg, there's one that was clicked as answered because I clicked on it. I was going to try to type out an answer, but didn't get to it. The question said, if fees are not coming out of the trust assets, i.e. the client pays for the services, is the requirement still to monitor there? Not under ERISA, potentially under state trust laws, but not from the retirement plan perspective. But you have to wonder if spending the corporate assets, is there any obligation there to pay only reasonable fees? And I would argue that yes, there is, but not under ERISA. Sorry, I had clicked, it moved to answered. So sorry.
And you do have to monitor, even if you're paying it out of corporate assets, you have to monitor that the services are being done. If you've outsourced loan administration to a record keeper and you're paying for the record keeper out of corporate assets, you still need to make sure that they're processing loans properly. There's less of a concern about paying too much fees, at least from an ERISA standpoint. But you have to make sure they're doing things properly.
Yeah, there's a comment here also about just sort of a practice pointer about retaining source documents for participant loans that extend beyond 5 years for the purchase of a home or things like that. Brian, you were talking about hardships a little bit. What are your thoughts about the proof of hardship under self-certification?
Well, that's, if you're referring to like the CARES Act stuff, yeah. I mean, the answer is in the question, self-certification. So Congress gave us the privilege of allowing the participant to self-certify. So since it's written into law, plan sponsor, committee members, you're off the hook. Vendors, you're off the hook. Congress gave the participant the right to self-certify, period.
And ultimately, that'll be between the participant and the IRS, right? So it's really taken all of us out of it. And now it's between the individual and when they file their taxes, frankly.
Yeah.
All right. I think that captures all. Haley, you're going to help me monitor these a little bit. I think I caught all the questions there.
I think you have, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. One asked, when will the slides be sent out. And I'm not today. They will be sent out very soon.
Yes, we'll send the slide deck and any additional information, including contact information for myself, Brian, and Haley today or tomorrow to everyone who attended and even everyone who signed up. So that will be coming out in the next day or two. All right, the final thing, we do have out on our website a resource guide that walks you through each categories in a little more detail. So if you're looking for more information, you can certainly go there. But also, like I said, the contact information for the three of us will be included when we send out the slide deck. So if you have any additional questions, we are all available to respond. So any final comments, Haley or Brian?
No, I mean, I'm thankful that everyone joined us today. I know that it's a lot, but it is, I think, part of your fiduciary duty. And so we're hopeful that this makes it more clear what you need to be doing.
Yeah, and what I tell all my committee members when we do training is, you folks are responsible for the largest liquid pool of assets that most Americans will ever have, their employer-sponsored retirement plan. It's not a passive position to sit on a committee. You are actually really going to change people's future and people's lives.
Well said. All right, with that, thank you everyone for joining today, and we will hope to see you next month for next month's webinar. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great day.